Thanks, Andrea, and thanks for having us here today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. So again, just to recap, I'm Cindy Stewart. I'm one of the regional parent liaisons for Adopt for Life. We're also joined by Rebecca Lovering-Spencer, our AFCCA consultant and educator, as well as Tracy Moisen, who's from the National Consortium on AFCCA. So today we're going to talk to you about AFCCA, aggression in childhood and youth towards family and caregivers. But we're going to begin before we get into that with the land acknowledgement. So we'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous people of all the lands that we are on today. While we're meeting this evening on a virtual platform, let's take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations, as well as improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From all over Ontario, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. So before we start, I'm going to introduce a little bit about Adopt for Life and our peer-to-peer support network. So what we offer at Adopt for Life, or one of the things that we offer at Adopt for Life, is confidential parent-to-parent support. We serve adoptive, kinship, and customary care parents and caregivers, and we can offer support in various ways. So it can include in-person support or one-on-one support virtually, advocacy, support groups, buddy and mentor matching, access to our online peer communities, interactive webinars, and our on-demand resources. So we're a peer-to-peer support network, peer adoptive and kinship and customary care parents and caregivers who have been there, supporting other parents and caregivers coming up. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tracy.
Thanks, Cindy. Just confirming you can hear me. Great. Zoom was not cooperating a minute ago. So welcome everyone. As Cindy and Andrea both said, my name is Tracy Moisen. I am the program director with the National Consortium on Aggression Toward Family and Caregivers in Childhood and Adolescence, or if you shorten that to AFCCA, which will be an acronym we're going to explore quite a bit tonight. I have a dual role. I'm also part of the team at Adopt for Life, and Adopt for Life was one of the founding members bringing together the National Consortium. Thank you everyone for being with us this evening. We are going to share with you first some of the insights and learnings that the consortium has had over the last year. That was really about helping us all gain a better understanding of AFCCA and what it looks like and feels like and is experienced by families. And I'm going to take about a half an hour to do that. And then I'm going to turn over to Rebecca, who is going to spend some time sharing about what we've also learned from families about what happens. Because as much as we have heard from families and parents and caregivers and youth themselves about how hard this can be, we've also heard some really inspiring things about what's helping and what's working in their families. So with that, I just wanted to take a moment and introduce the consortium and our partners. I mentioned Adopt for Life was a founding member of the consortium, but we're certainly not there alone. In fact, we're very proud to be at a table with 14 other partners from across Canada. You see a number of them mentioned here on this slide that represent families and lived experiences. So parents and caregivers, researchers from universities across Canada who are expanding the Canadian research on AFCCA and building on international research that has been in existence for quite some time. Practitioners and clinicians who are working with families, supporting them, supporting their children. Advocates from within our social systems, from child welfare, from youth justice, and organizations who are trying to understand the systemic barriers that are getting in the way for families and how we can help drive change through policy at a federal level, a provincial level, and at a regional or local level. And across the board, the membership from the consortium really did bring a cross-Canada lens from BC, from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast. I also wanted to highlight, the line you see on the bottom. I think the thing we are most proud of is that the consortium was also able to work with and bring forward lived experience from over 100 parents, caregivers, and young adults, and what we term to be first voice advocates. So those are youth and young adults who have experienced AFCCA in their own families, in their own homes, either directly themselves or as a sibling or as another family member. And all of them have very bravely and quite inspiring shared their stories and their experiences with us, what they wish people had known, what they wish their parents or caregivers had known, and also what might have helped. Before I dive into what we've learned over the last year with the consortium, there's an analogy here that one of our consortium members brought forward probably about a year or so ago with us. Some of you who are watching may recognize the term CPVA, which stands for Child to Parent Violence and Aggression. CPVA is a term that is used quite frequently internationally when talking about this issue. And certainly when Adopt for Life became part of conversations going back almost 3 years ago now, it's a term that we were using with families as well. We were extremely aware, though, of the challenges with that language and how much shame and stigma is attached to talking about this issue and for families to get help. And the more we have understood what's actually being experienced, this analogy came forward of thinking about the wind and how we think about wind as something that just exists around us. You maybe can't see it, you maybe can't feel it, you can't always quite put your finger on it, but it's there. And it's part of our environment, and it's part of just what we exist within our environment. And sometimes it's this gentle breeze and there's no visible trace of it, but it's still there. And other times it picks up speed and leaves start to move on trees. Sometimes it continues to build in intensity, but we can still withstand that. But sometimes it becomes so unexpectedly strong that it turns into something else. And it might start to feel like a tornado that batters everything that's in its path and knocks people off their feet. And when that happens, it's often difficult to weather that storm alone. If you think about it from a storm, we pull out our emergency supplies that we've often built up in advance, that we've planned for. We connect with others in our community to ensure that everyone is safe and cared for. And still, even with that, it can be scary and you can feel alone. And we often look for our community for safety and support. And when we considered that analogy, we realized so many of the families experiencing AFCCA are experiencing something similar. It's there, they know it's there, we're feeling it. There are things that we can put in place that help to mitigate it. And sometimes it's still stronger than what we can manage or withstand on our own. And what we understand is that families need the same type of community of support around them to help them weather that storm. And the more we thought about that analogy, it really did ring true for so much of what we were hearing from families and from youth. So with that, I touched on language. The language that the consortium is bringing forward from all of our cross-Canada partners and that we are landing and centering on is this term AFCCA, aggression toward family or caregivers in childhood and adolescence. And there's a definition there. I'm not going to read the full definition, but it is important that there's a consistent definition, that all of those researchers, practitioners, clinicians, families, social service providers that have participated in the consortium have said, yes, this is something that we can start to consistently use. And that's important because, as one of our consortium members said, language kicks off protocols. If we can start to identify what this is, if we can start to name it, if we can start to have a conversation without shame or stigma, then people can start to know how to help. And families can start to raise their hand and ask for help and know that what they're experiencing will be believed, it will be heard and understood, and that there will be professionals who will know how to help. So when we talk about AFCCA, we are talking about a pattern of aggressive behavior that is happening during childhood or adolescence. It's characterized by aggressive behavior by a child or adolescent toward their parent or other primary caregivers or other close family members in the home. It causes significant harm, and harm might be physical, it might be psychological. And it's important to note that harm is experienced by all of the family members. The adolescent themselves, the child or youth themselves, is experiencing harm. Certainly the person or people that the behavior is directed towards, and other family members who are witnessing that. And you'll see as we go through some of the data in a few minutes, we're not going to talk tonight about causation. I think there are multiple reasons this happens. And certainly there are multiple coexisting or co-related factors that our clinical teams have, and our voice of practice team have raised. But what does seem to be common is this stems from where a child is unable to find co-regulation with the adults caring for them, and that progressively that creates additional challenges in self-regulation. AFCCA is most often directed towards parents or primary caregivers, but it can also extend to caregivers in other settings. So when you think about youth who might be in alternative living arrangements, who might be in the child welfare system in a group home setting or other care, this still happens, and it can affect the caregivers in those settings as well. And certainly the risk is that the behavior commonly becomes entrenched over time and can escalate. I mentioned why we focus so much on language. Again, this is really about understanding the impact that our words have and centering on the very real experience that parents and caregivers report about the shame that is involved when they come forward and asking for help, and how often, in fact, they are blamed for what is happening. So when we set out from a consortium lens to say we need common language that others can recognize and can act on, we really wanted to do a few things. We wanted to equip families with language that lets them ask for help while conveying the severity of what's happening, while honoring lived experience of what was happening for both them and their children, avoiding further stigmatizing or shaming, while at the same time, language that is meaningful to the professionals who need to hear it and recognize that this is a family who needs help and that this is not an isolated incident. And just about the language itself, and I will say this language is still imperfect in some ways. We think it is significantly better than what has been used before. But there's certainly still room here that as we continue to learn more, that this language may still shift. But right now, the term AFCCA is intended to do a couple of things. It's intended to convey what is happening, who it is directed towards, families and caregivers, and when it is happening. This is not about naming or blaming a child or a youth, but simply indicating that this is happening during a developmental stage. And oftentimes when a child or youth doesn't have the skill or the capability yet to communicate their needs in a different way. We're going to share as we go through tonight just some of the stories and some of the experiences we've heard from parents and caregivers, and in some cases from youth themselves. And I wanted to start while we're talking about language and while we're talking about terminology, just sharing something that a youth, Jamie, and I will say we have changed all of the names in this presentation to protect individuals' privacy. Jamie is a young adult. She is autistic and is an advocate for children and youth in the autistic community. She's also a first voice advocate and lead for change within the child and welfare system. And she was diagnosed with autism at age 14. She shared with us that she experienced this throughout her childhood and throughout her teenage years, both herself and as a teenager. But some of the important things that Jamie told us was that this was often a response to feeling like she did not have the communication skills that would let her communicate in a different way. So you see, her quote at the top, if I can't use my words or if I can't get out what I need to say, I might hit myself or I might hit other people. She shared with us in a conversation with our consortium members, sometimes when you see violence, it's actually really a communications breakdown. But the part in particular that I wanted to highlight, because so many of the families we heard from, you'll see in the presentation, their children have coexisting or co-related neurodevelopmental disabilities or challenges. And Jamie spoke about her perspective, and these are her words: disabled children, disabled people in general are at a pretty vulnerable point in society. And she really cautioned that the instant that there was a perception of being labeled as violent or dangerous or aggressive, that risk to her as an individual with a disability in our society was significant, and that we needed to really understand the impact that our words have, as much as we wanted to recognize and honor what the lived experience of individuals, parents, and caregivers who were experiencing harm, that what was happening for their children and youth, that's actually where the harm stemmed from, the impact they were feeling, and how we recognize that. So I'm just going to take a few minutes and share some of the key insights and findings. There's extensive international data on this issue. There's actually not that much Canadian data. Luckily, that is changing. And if we get to the end of the presentation, we'll actually highlight some current Canadian research opportunities. But we're quite excited, might be the wrong word, but grateful for the amount of families and caregivers who came forward and shared their experiences with us and responded to a series of online focus groups across multiple provinces, a series of multiple online questionnaires, as well as individual one-on-one interviews. And so I'll start first with what we heard from youth and young adults. And really we have intentionally centered on their experiences. There's really 4 themes that they talk to us about. And first and foremost, they want to be seen, heard, and respected in conversations about AFCCA and about this issue. From an Adopt for Life lens, what we had seen in the first couple of years of talking about this was that the conversation very often focused on parents and caregivers. And that the youth voice was missing. Candidly, it is still missing. Although again, we're excited to have the opportunity to hear from those youth, and grateful for how many of them want to be part of the conversation. But this was a consistent theme, that they want to be part of this. They want to talk about it, and they recognize that talking about it and acknowledging what's happening from a place of safety and from a place of how can we help, helps move things forward. The second one they highlighted is that there is a common and very deep need for genuine connection and community. So many of the youth that we talked to expressed that they felt isolated, they felt alone, that the more this type of issue happened, the more there was aggressive behavior, the more they felt isolated in their communities and disconnected. And so when they talked about what helped, when they talked about what would make things better, there was this sense of, yes, they sometimes needed professional supports. Yes, they sometimes needed clinical supports. But most often what they said was they needed to feel connected to their communities around them, to schools, to community, to extended family, to churches in some case. But they needed to feel those genuine connections in ways that were part of their lives. They also talked to us, and you saw this in a little bit of Jamie's quotes, behavior is a form of communication. And so consistently, they told us that what was happening was a communication issue, and they didn't feel like they had the skills or the ability to communicate in a safer or more effective way. And the bottom one here, and I caution, the quotes around the word normal. I want to recognize that for some parents and caregivers who are living in extremely difficult or challenging situations, we don't in any way want to downplay what you're experiencing. But what they also said to us that this may be a normal pattern of behavior, and you might want to think about that as an expected pattern of behavior, that for children and youth, particularly those who may have experienced early traumatic experiences, adverse child experience or adverse experiences, or ACEs, as we might talk about, that this might be expected. and that in fact we might be better to prepare parents for what this might look like, how to recognize it, and what might help, rather than waiting till the storm occurs. Parents and caregivers, as you can imagine, told us that they felt some of the same things. There was also a unique perspective to parents and caregivers, and we've touched on this a little bit. There is immense shame and blame and stigma being experienced by all family members. So for parents who do put up their hand and ask for help, they frequently talk about not being believed. And that even when they are believed, there's a sense that there aren't enough skilled or qualified professionals who recognize this and know what to do. Families, the families that we spoke to, and you'll see some stats in a minute, are living with an extremely high level and frequently living with an extremely high level of dangerous behavior in their home. And that is concerning to us because again, if we start from a place of how does this affect or how does this harm the child or youth, and then how does that extend to all family members, families clearly told us they need help. They need more help, and they're trying to keep everyone safe. Parents and caregivers that we spoke to adamantly want to remain at the center of care for their child or adolescent. Excuse me. They are fighting to remain together, and you see that mentioned in the bottom one as well. But they very much feel like they are having to fight, and they are having to really cling to how do they stay at the center of care for their child. I mentioned, obviously, we've talked about Rebecca and Cindy and myself are all with Adopt for Life, but I should make sure it's very clear. AFCCA is not just an adoptive family issue. This is experienced by adoptive families and biological families. We heard that consistently. And all families, regardless of family origin or family makeup, are facing extensive roadblocks and barriers. So when a family does come forward and ask for help, there are a number of systems issues and roadblocks that are getting in the way. So we asked, we asked parents and caregivers to share some more specifics with us about what this looks like in their home. I mentioned, so I'm going to start on the left here. I mentioned that parents and caregivers told us that they're living with, in many cases, much more intense and much more frequent episodes of aggressive behavior than what we understood. Out of about 70 participants who participated in an online survey, 76% of them told us that they were experiencing daily or weekly incidents of violence or aggression in their home. And 55% of them considered the intensity of that to be an 8 out of 10 or higher. So if you think about that in terms of what the entire family is experiencing, 76% are saying daily or weekly, and 55% of them are saying it's an 8 out of 10 in terms of what their family is experiencing. When we ask them to define what it looks like, so what's included in AFCCA, you really do see a range. And if you look at the data in the center here, one thing I will say, is parents or caregivers could choose all that applied. So for anyone looking at this, trying to figure out how the numbers add up to 100, they don't. Because parents can choose and often chose multiple descriptors and recognize that it looks different at different points in time. But there's certainly some commonality. So 90% said that it included angry or aggressive outbursts toward others. As you go through some of these descriptions, it's also very commonly psychological or emotional injury. It's not always physical harm. Often destruction of property or destruction of things, aggressive body language or posturing, physical injury or harm is still quite high. And you do see here, I'm looking at the 62% physical or injury or harm to self and 54% psychological injury or harm to self. For some who may be listening and who may be experiencing this, what we heard in more of the data was that quite often their teens or their youth are experiencing self-harm or self-injurious behaviors, but that to be part of what we consider AFCCA, it was also accompanied by harm to others. So they were certainly seeing harm directed towards themselves, but also directed towards other family members. And you see that in this chart on the right as well. Most often this is directed towards the primary parent or caregiver, so 76%, but also often you can commonly see here siblings, self-harm towards the youth themselves, and it can also extend to pets or animals and other individuals in the home. And again, it's notable here, 21% saying all of the above. All of this data and considerably more also lives online publicly at the consortium's national website. So www.afcca-apfea, which for any of French language speakers is the French translation. And the core consortium materials are available in both French and English. We also wanted to understand when this is happening. So again, we talked very broadly so far about childhood and adolescence. I think one of our assumptions or one of our beliefs as the consortium was coming together was that typically this started with older children into teens and intensified in adolescence. And what we found was that that was partially true, the piece about it commonly intensifying in adolescence. But what we heard from parents and caregivers was that, in fact, this was actually commonly observed in younger children. And that for many parents and caregivers, in fact, said, you know, if I had known what to look for, or if I had known what was happening, there were signs that they could see that would have been indicators, that signs that their child was struggling in a way that exceeded what would have been normal or typical from a developmental stage of a younger child. And so the data and how to read this circle on the right is that, you know, just over a quarter of them said that there was AFCCA behaviors happening in children as young as 2, and that those were often predictive of what became more intense experiences later. Again, you know, just about a third of them said their children were 13 to 18. All of the above shows up here again. And the one that I just wanted to touch on is this small slice that says 19 plus. I just want to be careful how that's interpreted. That does not mean that that's that this stops at 19. In fact, we now know and have some data that suggests it very much does not. It can often continue into early 20s and young adulthood. This is an indication of sampling. The consortium very much was focused on the experience of childhood and adolescence. And so we didn't seek out audience sample of over 19. It's certainly an area that we think still needs to be looked at. And we're excited about some of the research that's happening, particularly at the University of Ottawa, that will look up to age 26 to see what that data looks like. So I mentioned at the beginning, we were not trying to get to causation. I think we recognize this happens in lots of different families with lots of different makeup. But we did want to understand where there were correlated or coexisting conditions, other factors. And certainly there is a high coexistence of neurodevelopmental disorders or disabilities. You see what's on here is a word cloud just based on what we heard from parents and caregivers and youth themselves of what they most often reported or what they most often said was also coexisting for their children. Again, all of this data exists on the website. And for anyone who's watching who might be in a clinical role, there is an operational definition on the website that goes into more detail about what we saw in terms of coexisting factors. The takeaway, though, was that quite often for a lot of the families that we spoke to and that we continue to speak to and that Adopt for Life supports is that there is a high rate of individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders or disabilities where this also becomes a factor. So we talked a little bit about impact and harm. And what this is intended to show is what we heard from families. I do think it's important to say we've intentionally framed this by what we heard first from youth themselves. So impacts to the child and adolescence, and recognizing that the harm actually starts there. And then it starts to expand out to their parents, their caregivers, their siblings. And when collectively we're not prepared to respond to it, this becomes an impact to communities and eventually larger societal issues. But starting with the children and youth at the center of that, what we most commonly heard were escalating mental health issues, diminishing self-esteem or self-worth. They're certainly feeling the damage to their family relationships. And we talked before about isolation, those barriers to belonging, barriers to being part of their community. When they're experiencing dysregulation, the isolation that can cause in other social or community settings. And there's a very strong risk of criminalization of children or adolescents and depiction as violent perpetrators, and which in turn becomes a factor around entry or possible re-entry into the child protection system, and can lead to instability for children in care or placement stability post-adoption for families. And again, where this is unchecked, or where we are failing to meet the needs of families and youth, there is a risk of this becoming entrenched behavior into adulthood. And so many of the children and youth that we spoke to spoke about that, the fear that the behavior would continue into adulthood, and how they could be supported with skills development that would help them learn to manage the behavior and learn to regulate. And then again, none of that mitigates the impact that parents and caregivers are feeling. And while some of that list is the same, there are some notable differences, and it really does start with the physical and psychological injury or risk of injury that they're living with. Again, escalating mental health issues, secondary trauma from what their family members might be experiencing in the home, damaged family relationships to the whole unit, and parents or caregivers feeling that same sense of isolation. Not being part of a community, or not feeling like they had access to peers who would understand what was happening within their family. We heard often of increased risk of separation and divorce, marriage or family breakdowns. Many are experiencing investigation by child protection services. And again, they also spoke about placement instability, not only for the child or youth who was experiencing AFCCA, but for other siblings in the home. And in some cases, this can extend to loss of employment, where parents have had to, one parent may have to stay home to provide the level of intense care or supervision that's needed, and the financial strain that can cause. And that financial strain may come from loss of employment. It may come from needing to privately access services or supports that might not be publicly available. In some cases, it's purely about the demands of having to continue to repair or fix things that are happening within their home. So I'm just going to share another story. In this case, Jordan is an adoptive parent. She adopted their daughter at 13 months. Jordan's an example of someone who signs of AFCCA started to appear in their family when her daughter was still a toddler. And having had experience working in child development, she was recognizing that what she was seeing from her daughter exceeded what would have fell within, developmental norms. Her daughter was diagnosed with a reactive attachment disorder at 4 years old. And by the time she was 12, there was regular ongoing aggression directed towards her mom and witnessed by another sibling in the home. And she spoke about having the choices of having to make, and as a parent, trying to keep everyone in their family safe and trying to keep everyone okay. And feeling like when she was asking for help, that there were no real good options for keeping her family safe and all together under the same roof. But this is where the hard also starts. You can start to see some hope, because Jordan's an example where they've really created an option that allows her daughter to be parented with a family friend, where her daughter lives with a family friend, but they parent her in what she describes as sort of village approach. And it may not look traditional, it may not look the way that she expected that it would, but it's actually supporting her child with more of what she needs and responding to her attachment needs. But the important thing that Jordan also talked about too was and I'm going to read her quote, having to fight, and spend so much time talking about all the negative things about your kid changes you as a parent. And so she really talked about when she was seeking out supports, when she was seeking out professional services or providers, that she started going into meetings with a whole other opening. And so she talked about all the other things that made up her daughter. I'd say she's an incredible gymnast. She's hilarious. And then I'd say, and these are the behaviors that we're dealing with, and this is why we need help. And how much that shift changed the conversations for her and changed in some ways how her daughter was perceived. Which kind of leads to what we heard about. We asked families about, what does success look like? So many of the families we talked to said, we're starting to figure things out. We're starting to figure out what might work. The quote on the left is from one of our consortium members, who's also a parent with lived experience themselves. And it struck me when she said to us one day, can you teach us to walk in the storm? So talking about that idea of AFCCA as a storm or as a wind, instead of working so hard to avoid it. And so when we asked families about what success looked like, we were really struck by some of the things they told us. And two things here, and I'm going to jump around a little bit in the screen sharing. You would expect that, or we expected, that every parent would say, I need the behavior to stop. I need the aggressive behavior to stop. And while that's certainly high at 88%, what we actually saw was that it wasn't the top thing. In fact, 92% said they would view success as the ability to help their child or adolescent self-regulate in an improved way. There were so many ways that parents or caregivers thought about successful outcomes. How can I improve the relationship between myself and my child? How can I help my child improve their relationship with their siblings? How can we create enhanced safety for other children in the home and for the children or adolescent themselves? How can we improve attachment? A notable one, 66%. How do we reduce the risk of family disruption or separation? So how do we keep everybody in a safer place where we can be okay? And 58% also said increased parent or caregiver understanding. So many of the parents or caregivers that we talked to wanted a better understanding of what was happening, what parts they could influence or support, what else might help, or where there might be more other parents or caregivers who could share what worked for them. That whole aspect of peer support comes through very strongly, of wanting to feel like you're in a room surrounded by other people who understand. And I'm just going to touch on the barriers here. We could spend a whole hour talking about this piece of it, but there are certainly systemic issues that are getting in the way for families who do step forward and ask for help. Inequitable systems responses, and that speaks to some of the systemic issues in our child welfare systems, in our youth justice systems. You have to acknowledge that a lot of the families who are finding success also acknowledge the privilege that they have, and that may be around employment, it may be around education, it may be around, the ability to connect or advocate for their child, and to do so within systems where they may receive a very different response than someone who might be part of a marginalized community, as an example. So there is systemic change there that is out of the control of many families, and that we need to acknowledge is putting some families even at a greater disadvantage. There is a lack of qualified or skilled professionals who understand this and who can recognize and respond to what families need. And certainly, when we consider families across not just Ontario, but across Canada, geographical location comes in. So if you're in a rural environment or in a more isolated physical setting, you probably have less access to services. If there is a benefit to some of the shifts in services we have seen as a result of COVID, it would be some parents said they had more access to online services or virtual services than they had in the past. But this geographical isolation can still play in. And again, gaps in public policy that we've spoken about. And I'm sure our partners from PCMH and from CMHO would talk about just the complexity in navigating children's mental health. So making it easier for parents and caregivers to find the help and to access the help they need. And then there's just an aspect of daily living challenges. And what we mean by that is, if you're a parent and you have multiple children at home, even something as simple as seemingly simple as having childcare for your children so that you can then access other treatments or services for your child who is experiencing AFCCA. So just understanding the barriers to accessibility and how we break that down for families. And again, there's much more information on the AFCCA website about all of these. For time's sake, I will keep going. Again, another story with Sam and Michelle. Sam is an adoptive parent. Their daughter, Michelle, was adopted at age 9 and had experienced pretty significant trauma while in foster care. She also lives with a neurodevelopmental delay, and she's experienced significant and increasing aggression. And they have struggled to navigate the mental health system, the youth justice system. But they're also a parent who has found kind of a non-traditional way. She describes herself as a non-traditional caregiver. Their daughter lives outside of their home in a supervised, staffed setting, but they're very much still part of her life. They have had to fight and advocate to remain her parents, her legal guardians, but she doesn't live with them. But they still very much view themselves as family, as her parents, and are still active in her life. And the quote of, when we first adopted, we committed to help her be the happiest, healthiest, safest, and most successful Michelle that she can and wants to be. We've done that. It's just that she lives in a different part of the province from us. So that concept, again, of families having to fight to stay together, non-traditional views of what family preservation might look like. There are multiple different examples of how families are solving for that. So I'm going to transition here to Rebecca. And I just, one last quote as we make this shift. So much of what we heard from families and caregivers were about what are they figuring out? Where are their lessons that we can learn? And the quote that struck from one of our practitioners was, people can't change unless they feel physically and emotionally safe. Once safety is achieved, then you can move forward to developing those skill sets. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Rebecca. Rebecca, I don't think we're hearing you.
Yeah, sorry. We can see that slide again though, right?
Yep.
All right, great. Thank you, Tracy. We are, so my piece when carrying on the discussion around this is really taking that metaphor that Tracy outlined earlier, using the wind. And so if you look at this illustration, we have a lotus and each section is colored. So think about that as a traffic light or whatever you might, right? So crisis being red, stop, really windy, like the house might blow away. We need to really focus on only survival and making sure people are safe. Whereas the yellow is more of a supportive time when perhaps we're gearing up, thinking that perhaps the wind might get even stronger. So we need to prepare ourselves for a major windstorm, or we're just managing or coming back down from one. Whereas the green area, we're going to be kind of considering that restorative place, right? So we can do some intensive interventions that might help create and maintain safety. During this next little bit, this illustration, we've got the wind in sort of bubbles, right? Like, so we've got the red in this particular screen. It looks a little bit turquoise to me, but you get the idea. So we're going to kind of hone in. We can access this information from any point, and there's a lot of overlap, right? So some of the things we do when we're looking to support ourselves and reach out for help, a lot of it would be great if we could do that in the green, right? When the winds are calm. That's always ideal. But we've kind of categorized things more in the sense of how we have experienced people asking for help. So a lot of the families that I've supported over the years, in the red section, they're going to ask for certain things. And so that's kind of how we've outlined it here. And it has been such an honor for me over the years to hold the stories of so many families and talk to parents around what they've been going through. And so all of this that Tracy's talked about is very consortium driven. And a lot of what I'm talking about is also driven by information from the consortium and confirmed by our experience supporting families. And so there might be a few things that are in addition to, because it just might not be something the consortiums highlighted or Tracy, knew I would be talking about. So that's kind of where we're coming from. So most of the slides are going to look like this. We've got a bubble, and then I've got a few talking points around this and what we have found as people with lived experience, helping others with experience that they're going through as a peer-to-peer model, is that initially when it is that red storm, it is sometimes very difficult for us to acknowledge what is happening with everyone in our family. So just even starting there on a very basic beginning can be difficult. And so for those of us who are struggling, having a moment where we're able to acknowledge what's happening. What we're hoping is that some of the work that the consortium has done by Tracy highlighting, for instance, the name that we're using and the reason why we're using it, hopefully even that is helpful in our families as a beginning, because we have language to describe what's going on, right? There's aggression, it's directed towards me. And as we reach out, to medical supports or mental health agencies, we can also use that language to explain what's happening in our home. It's very basic, and yet it's not always there for us. So as these winds are very strong, we also want to recognize that the reason why we sometimes don't acknowledge what's going on is because we are ashamed. And so many of our families have come to us and shared with us for the first time ever what's going on in their home, because they didn't have a safe place, or they started reaching out for help earlier and people turned the blame back on them. Well, if you were just more authoritarian as a parent, or, oh, you're too permissive, or maybe you need to be more permissive, and turned it back on the parent. And so there wasn't a safe place for a parent to reveal what's going on. So we have carried the tears and journeyed with parents during this period while they're just coming to terms with what it sounds like to describe. And then what happens with shame is shame thrives in the dark, right? Especially if you're listening to Brene Brown or resources like this. She's very good at explaining how shame works. And so, as we bring these secrets about what's happening in our home into the light, the shame diminishes because it can no longer thrive in the dark. The light is shining on it. So as each person in the home is acknowledging what is happening, we can then take a look at prioritizing what issues we need to be dealing with. So often, I'm talking to you as if you are the one driving this as the parent. You're the one taking a look at how am I going to navigate, but hopefully you've got other supports in place that we'll talk about a little bit later, but maybe someone else is helping you prioritize the issues as well. Sometimes having someone else look into your situation can help you see that maybe, I know for me, when our home is chaotic and I don't know which way is up, and I'm living moment by moment rather than, this objective place where I'm able to, keep a sense of objectivity. Sometimes someone else helping me prioritize the day, the week, the moment, the year, gives me the perspective I need to actually deal with things that are going to help rather than just dealing with something that is fairly insignificant to the overall problem in my home. So I'm trying to think about some of the stories we've heard about people prioritizing issues, and I think that a lot of us know what needs to be addressed first, but we don't really have a formal way of doing that. And some of the resources, like tools that are given, are to perhaps have 3 baskets. This is a tool used in NVR, nonviolent resistance. 3 baskets, something that's incredibly important to change, something that's, we'd like to change, but we can live without that change, and something that we can put off and not deal with at the time at all during this time. So when it's really hot and things are at risk, we're dealing with the really important things, health and safety, right? That's often the thing that we have to look at first. And we're not going to get into some of those smaller issues. And one of them, that's a tool that many of our families have said has been helpful, are some de-escalation strategies. And I think a lot of us who have watched the media can recognize how different institutions have a variety of people. Some people really do well in de-escalating a situation, and other people seem to escalate a situation. And so what's the difference? Why are some people moving the crisis into more of a crisis, and other people are able to de-escalate? And I think some of it is training and knowledge. Those parents that first brought this to our attention, some of them were already well into the years of trying to parent a child who was aggressive. And they said that if they had done this training earlier, they think that the trajectory would have been a lot different for their family, because they didn't realize how much they were contributing to the escalation and a lot of that can be trained in terms of understanding human nature. So there's tons of organizations that do it. Unfortunately, a lot of them do it for other staff, like group home staff or hospitals. It's difficult to find something that's directed towards parents. It can be done, and some of them will modify it, and some of them will do like group training. So there are possibilities, but looking into that has been a hugely helpful thing for a lot of our families. And I know when I've done the training in the past, at different times I'm absorbing different information. So sometimes it's about body language, if I'm demeaning and or like sort of hovering over someone, well, not obviously like that, but like just standing up and someone sitting down. I mean, that's a power move. So if I were able to put my body in a position that was more in line with them, but not risking my own safety, so I make sure that I am between the person and a door, so I can leave if things get worse. Those are the kinds of teachings that the de-escalation programs can do. And some of them do it online, and some of them can do it over a weekend. Some of it can be learned from a book or YouTube. I mean, there's lots of ways to learn it, but it has been an experience that a number of our parents have found helpful, especially when one parent is parenting one way and one parent's another. Unfortunately, often there's a gender piece there too. A lot of people find that the men are raised to be more aggressive towards aggression, and women are taught to be more nurturing towards, whatever. I don't want to get into cause there, but it's something that a lot of our families have spoken about, and it's my experience too. Okay, so respite. As much as we know respite is a formality that families need, and we do, sometimes we forget in a crisis that respite can look different during different periods and for different people. So I know it's really hard to find formalized respite. Group homes or various organizations do have some things that are covered if you go in through the right channel, or sometimes you can get that privately. And there are different organizations that can help with some of the funding, but it's very taxed. And I know that a lot of our families have a very difficult time finding respite. Respite can also look, it can be informal, right? So it can be in your home, or it can be outside of the home. It can be someone who's paid, or it can be something that would be considered kind of natural, like an aunt or an uncle doing a trip to a movie or a place that a child that enjoys, and it involves a distance between the parent and the child. That can be part of our respite plans. And in a crisis, when the winds are so violent, some of our families find that our children aren't behaving that way outside of our home or with other people. And so it's a little easier for us to make those arrangements with family or friends in the community to get some respite outside the home or inside. So someone might come into a home and play cards while a parent just takes a breather, has a shower, goes for a walk, goes for tea with someone who is a support to the parent, but maybe that person can't be in their home because they're intimidated by some of the aggression. So many ways to try and access. And so, when we're really caught up in the wind, it's very hard to think clearly. So, maybe gathering another person or some people together to talk about how we might find respite is maybe a way to access other people's creative juices and have them look more objectively at our situation when we're kind of stuck in survival. Safety plans. So ideally, safety plans are created when a family is not in crisis, right? The best place for doing a safety plan is in the green. So I'll probably mention it again there. I think I have another slide for this there, but some of our families are told their safety plan is call 911. And 911 can certainly be an important part of our safety plans. It is not the only way to do a safety plan. There are safety plans that can be quite detailed. And although we don't have the liability insurance to, really get into what that plan we would like, to see and share that with you, I can share with you, that some parents have a beginning of their safety plan that talks about, what does my child look like when they're escalating? Because this is, once again, taking a look at the preventative, right? So as we see someone escalating, if we have a plan as to how we're going to deal with it, perhaps that will de-escalate or at least not contribute to the escalation. So there might be a component to what happens when we see someone escalating. There might be things like considerations for other people in the family, children, pets. When our child is doing this and we see this happening, we're going to put the other children in the basement. They're going to watch TV, no matter, if they're supposed to be doing homework, doesn't matter. They go downstairs to watch TV, and we bring the animals down there with them. That might be something that some of our families have included in their plan. And then as things move up in terms of concern, the plan can include what that might involve. Some of our families have developed relationships with other neighbors. And once again, they find that just a new person speaking into something or showing up diverts the attention or somehow brings down the behavior for an individual. Maybe they're feeling that they don't want other people to see them this escalated. Whatever the reason, having someone else pop in as things are getting more escalated helps. So, we've got people in apartments who knock on the wall, and the next door neighbor comes over and asks to borrow, a cup of sugar or, something like that. And then the behavior might move down, or if it doesn't, it can be another entry into a part of the plan, which is, okay, this person is then asked, could you please call 911, or, they can be brought into another section of the plan. So having a safety plan is best to develop it in the green, but if not, this is where we get a lot of calls when we're already in the red and we just don't know what to do. When do I call the police? I've never thought about that before. Like, is now the time? And so, having thought about that and having a plan and having other people speaking to that plan having it on the fridge, laminating it, putting it in, behind the couch, various places to be able to access it when we're in chaos and our brain is once again just filled with the stress hormones. We can't think straight. We have this piece of paper. It's got phone numbers on it. It's got maybe a key attached to the back so we can, hop in the car if our children are old enough, whatever it might be. Some of the learning we've had from the families that we support has involved youth justice. And I wrote a couple notes. I want to say the right words. So let me just say, if your child is facing charges, because sometimes we find ourselves in that position, a parent can ask about youth diversion programs and a restorative justice approach. It's difficult, right? Because there's this overloaded system. Public defenders are overloaded. We've got prosecutors who are not always informed. Discretion is sometimes applied in these situations. So there's inconsistency applied to accessing these programs. So maybe if we're thinking that things are headed in this direction, or we just want to be prepared, we can familiarize ourselves with options under the Youth Justice Act, and consider youth justice and restorative justice in situations where it might be necessary to make sure that our children are not over criminalized, and that jail is not the answer to help in the future. For a lot of our kids, they need something different, and so we have the right to ask for that. So that's the red, right? That's all the really big, hold my breath, talk really fast, because it's critical kind of stuff. And so as we consider maybe moving down into the yellow or amber, where the wind is a little less intense, where we're maybe looking around, we're thinking, there's a storm sort of maybe brewing and it's starting to come my way. I don't know how big it's going to be. Once again, we can prioritize the issues. We can start to take a look at, okay, we've been here before. The wind has blown before, and if it really were a tropical storm that's coming up, there are procedures in place, right? We have horns that get sounded. We have alerts that show up on phones. Neighbors help each other. They pass, the sand bags, so that the water doesn't flood over, or the boards for the windows, right? So if we're looking at that metaphor in our lives, this is where we want to look at things like our safety plan. What are we going to do when the wind starts to blow? How can we prepare best? Which issues do we want to look at? I'm not going to mop the floor when I need to be boarding up the windows, right? This is where that priority evaluation is really helpful. Relying on peer supports. So, right, this kind of leads to that. So we have to have people that we can call on to help, hammer in the boards on our windows or whatever that might be. I can't always reach up high and I need someone with a ladder, whatever supports that might be. This is key. And a lot of the supports and the therapies and the resources that are being shown that help and that work really do rely on the peer support. So I'm so pleased to be presenting to you, because I know that that's a model that you're using, and a peer-to-peer support is a huge asset for a lot of our families. They realize they are not alone. They can ask for help, or they can ask for help in terms of ideas. So maybe someone can't come over physically and help, but they can say, hey, this is what I've done in this circumstance. And all of a sudden, why didn't I think of that? Of course, why don't I try that? So, sometimes the best work is done when we're with people who get it and understand some of the nuances, and you don't have to keep clearing through like, oh, why didn't you ask your mom? And why didn't, right? Well, because we understand that my mom's not, able to handle this situation, and it's actually causing, perhaps some difficulty in the scenario, whatever that that might be. But peer supports can also be people who aren't walking the road with us. It can also be someone who you might just find yourself like having a good laugh with. You know, so reaching out to our fun friends, nothing to do with our kids at all, and making time for that is part of our self-care. And in a moment, I'm going to ask Cindy to share, because as soon as I said that word, I actually felt physically like, oh, I know that word is not always well received anymore. It's overused, but I think it's also misunderstood, right? Because it doesn't, self-care doesn't mean going away for a week to a tropical location, or a weekend at the spa, or even getting our nails done. I mean, it can, if that is something that can be done and you have the resources to do that, and it restores you and it makes you, you know, more self-aware. But a lot of us don't even have the self-esteem sometimes to prioritize our own issues, prioritize our own self. And so building parent self-esteem, building our self-esteem, building one another's self-esteem is something that can be a bit tricky. We're all day, or some, maybe not all day, but periodically we're torn down by our child, and then we reach out for help, and then we're kind of accused by the system. And although, you know, cognitively, we know we're doing our best, and we feel really good about, you know, how well we're reaching out, or, you know, like even at our best, something in the back of our minds wonders if maybe it's us. Maybe I just, you know, I'm not the right parent. I'm not a good enough parent. I have too much of a temper myself. They learned it from me. Whatever insecurity we might have internalized can be really difficult at this point. And some of our parents have taught us that, you know, during this period, having someone speak to us about what's working is sometimes critical. So I've been able to do that for some of our families. I've been able to do that as a peer and as a friend, and my friends and my circles have been able to speak to those things for me. And it's incredible how much that can help, because I don't always realize that I've internalized a message until someone points out to me that you're really good at taking a breath before you respond to your kid. I would just feel like smacking them, but you know, and all of a sudden, oh, you know, like, yeah, I know I am, but like now I really believe it. Identifying if we're stuck somewhere, and then overcoming that. I mean, how great is that when we can recognize we've done something like that. But Cindy, do you want to take a moment and just share with us your thoughts around the term self-care?
Yeah, I'll chime in, because we had a great conversation, the three of us, last week. And I've been working in the health and wellness industry for many years. And so self-care, it's like, it became a very popular word. And with a lot of parents that I worked with, they began to have issues with the word self-care. And then let alone now parents parenting through AFCCA, like self-care seems completely incongruent. So like Rebecca was saying, you know, this idea of what lights you up. Oh, I go on a vacation, I go for a girls' night. Those things are inaccessible to a lot of our parents. So the lingo started to address that. Like, you can take a bubble bath, you know, it doesn't have to be small, drink a tea. But the thing, even in AFCCA families, a lot of the time, that tea can be dangerous. That tea might get knocked out of your hand and spilt on you. Like, there is very few safe moments to practice these self-care. So we started brainstorming, maybe self-care can be seen as an acronym. So what we came up with was C for care is compassion, self-compassion. In every moment, feeling compassionate towards yourself, the same way that you do towards your children. So parenting through AFCCA, at least in my experience, I make mistakes every day. In every moment, I make mistakes. But, you know, I need to have compassion for myself, keep myself up. the same way as when my children make mistakes, I don't beat them up for it. I'm compassionate towards them. So having the same attitude towards myself. And then the A in care, we came up with awareness. So self-awareness, being aware in every moment. And I understand, and many times we're thrown into this fight or flight response. The awareness goes out the window, but taking a moment after that, or before you go to bed, when you wake up in the morning, to just develop that self-awareness, like, are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Do you have a sore shoulder? When my child said such and such that triggered me, what happened to me previously that it's reminding me of. So, I feel as parents, we have this hypervigilance towards our children, so hyper aware of what are they going to do, but we can apply that same awareness to our own self. So then R is respect, self-respect. And the way I thought of that is how we speak to other people respectfully, most of us. We need to have the same kind of respectful self-talk towards ourselves. So in every moment hearing, like whatever it is that's that negative self-talk, I wouldn't say that to my friends, so I'm not going to say that to myself, and constantly replacing it. And then with compassion, not beating yourself up. There I go, talking badly towards myself again, but just compassionately, speaking respectful. So then the E in self-care, what I thought was efficacy, which in many of my teachings, that's been taught, that's the number one indicator for health and wellness. So if somebody is given whatever diagnosis, they have a certain survival rate, the number one indicator whether they will survive is efficacy. So efficacy is the belief that you can make a difference, the belief that what you do will actually affect change. And in my own, like, I have lived experience with AFCCA, that efficacy, that's been the biggest indicator for me too, because certainly I went through a period of time thinking it doesn't matter what I do, this will never change, those kind of things. Once I shifted that and began to really notice, yes, that, I can make a difference here, that made the biggest change. So that's our take on self-care: compassion, awareness, respect, and efficacy.
And I think that, sorry, I was just distracted for a sec, but I think that when you say that, you meant the word hope comes to mind, Cindy. You say maybe you don't think that this is ever going to change. And that's a very natural default mode that I have. And I know a lot of the families I've supported get stuck in, it's forever. This moment is forever. This moment is forever. This moment is forever. And a lot of the recovery programs include ways of recognizing the here and now, and then the successes in it, right? So right now, I'm having a moment that is filled with hope, right? So right now, things are calm, or right now I have a break, or right now, and then building on that, so that we're not just focused, because the glass is what it is. It's either full or not full, right? Like it is, but we can, there's always in our family lives, in terms of behavior and in stress and in terms of danger, there's always some, and there's always some not, right? So not just getting bombarded by the danger, but when there's moments of calm, and when there's moments that we do well in the danger, and we don't find ourselves falling into panic, and we do well, or we breathe, or we take a moment, or we follow our plan. Like that, there's a lot of hope that can come from that. So that's the word that comes to my mind, and recognizing our strengths, right? Like that's so important. I'm thinking about some other programs too. When you're saying that, I was thinking about, is it Bruce Perry that does the self-care and self-aware, which is just those micro moments that you spoke about. So there's some things that are more formalized programs that people can kind of rely on if they're thinking about that. Or at 7:45, so we're still good to continue on. Thanks, Cindy, for sharing that, because it's a difficult concept for a lot of us, especially when we compare ourselves to others' lives, right? Oh, my friend went and did this that weekend. Oh, did this, and it's not my life. I don't have that ability. I need to stay home and make sure, my child's safe, or whatever it might be. So early intervention, communication, dysregulation, a couple of things about this. Tracy talked about how behavior can be communication. And so, especially when we're dealing with co-concurring situations or diagnoses, the earlier we can get in there and find out what a child is trying to communicate to us, the more likely we are to be able to create an environment within which they don't have to resort, or certain behaviors don't necessarily come out as much. Also, communication the other way, our communication to our child. A lot of times, early intervention will help us with parenting strategies that will help with the dysregulation. Stuart Shankert is someone that we have relied on. He's a local guy, Toronto, local Ontario, providing, resources. He's got some books and some strategies online around self-regulation. How do we regulate ourselves, and so that we can co-regulate with our child? There's a lot of theories around, our regulation having an influence on our children. Seeking multidisciplinary supports. So not just going down the one avenue. We've got lots of people involved, and lots of people that need to be at our tables. And those tables can talk to each other. I think as parents, we think that can't happen because the system is really set up in silos. But trying to find ways to bring those together, or insisting that someone finds that way. If we have a case manager or someone involved, that the various voices are collaborating with one another, so that we're not getting competing, conflicting advice. Over here we're getting this advice, and over here we're getting that advice, and they don't really go together. But having that piece in there, helping develop advocacy and accountability, making sure there are people in there with us. So some of us often, we're in meeting after meeting after meeting for a child. And so not everyone can be involved, because someone has to be, at work, or someone is just too worn down, or there's geographical concern. And sometimes having a friend or a family or another designated person, maybe, I don't know if PMNH has the ability to attend meetings, but someone else in the meeting to bear witness to just what's going on. And a watched meeting changes the behavior of people at the meeting. So having someone else there, a lot of parents at schools and other places have told us that when they're on their own, their voice really isn't heard. But when a professional or someone who is there as a witness to take notes, or help a parent remember what they wanted to say, or challenge the system, when that person is there, people around the table tend to take them more seriously, and there's more accountability. There can be follow-up. And a parent isn't the only one. We're not the ones that's drained over and over again. And I also find it's very hard for me to advocate for my child, because I'm so emotionally invested that if I hear another no, I'm just like, right, okay, you won't, and I'll walk away. But having someone there to buffer that, and they, can stand firm on continuing to ask while I'm having a difficult time. So that's the attending family meetings, developing family advocates, and just once again, building on our family strengths, not just my strengths to build my self-esteem, but the dynamics in our home. What's working? What does work? What is going on that we're good at? Like, in my family, we can laugh. It's the weirdest thing. Like other people would think it's inappropriate, but it's for us, we laugh at stuff, and it's releasing and it's calming for us. And so we consider that a strength that we have as a family. We can laugh at the difficult stuff. You know, in emergency rooms, it's maybe not socially appropriate, but it helps us as a family to reconnect as well. We're in this together, and isn't this ridiculous? And it's horrible. And yet here we are again. It also brings a levity for us. So that might be our strength. And it isn't necessarily what other people, in the healthcare system might say is a strength, right? And the emergency room practitioner might not, but to really know what our strengths are, so that when we are laughing in the emergency room, we can see it as a strength, rather than feel like we have to be different and try and fit in. Okay, we've got some time. So, right, we're going till 8:30 and we're doing questions around 1:15, right? Andrea?
It was till 8, but
okay. That case, the other way around. There's not a lot here that I need to spend time on then. So I will just, green is where we do it, right? So acknowledge what's happening. This has happened in our home. We don't need to ignore it after an event, right? So the winds are down, it's calm, there's a light breeze. Lots of us want to bury our head in the sand and pretend that thing didn't happen. It's a good time. Yeah, if you need to bury your head for a little bit, as long as you're doing it intentionally for a period of time. A lot of the parents have come to us and said, what really helps is to say words around what happened, and then look back and say, what issues would we have prioritized? And moving forward, what issues are we going to prioritize? I've gotten caught up in those things in the past in my family dynamics where I'm harping on that small issue that I said wasn't even an issue. And I'm ignoring the one that is pretty critical to avoid a crisis, or to at least make sure a crisis is not one. So relying on those peer supports, hugely important during this time. That's where we can develop them. We're feeling good. We can ask people. We're not as insecure. So after an incident, rebuilding relationships. Sometimes we've had to cut someone else. We haven't responded to emails, whatever. Maybe we've said some harmful things to someone in our family. We've blamed someone for our behavior. We need to come back to that. And our families have shown us over and over again how it can happen, and the restoration can take place, and we can help our child also restore relationships with people they might have harmed, building those holistic circles of support around us. Skills development, once again, tons of resources in the world, but if for our kids and the kids that were loving and having a hard time finding supports around, we've got a slide a little bit later or two that has a few resources that can give sort of some of those tangible skills, and the slide Tracy gave earlier, indication that sometimes we need to do a skills development before we do a therapy. We need to stabilize ourselves, feel safe and be safe before we can dig into the other stuff, right? For our families, we need to locate trauma-informed therapy. As many of our people tell us that the parents feel that they have been traumatized by their child's behavior. And so being able to find therapy for ourselves, or help for us as we're suffering with PTSD or, trauma from, and we've talked about developing that safety plan. Tracy, I think we're going to skip this example here. Yeah. And we'll just go straight to some of the AFCCA resources. Cindy, were you going to speak to that? I can't.
I think Tracy's going to share the.
Is that Tracy? Yeah, that's right with that. Okay. Sorry, we'll stop sharing or keep sharing.
Just keep sharing yours, Rebecca. Okay. That's totally fine. So some of the resources that are there on the next two slides are just to give you some more specifics. And again, I think I've said it, Rebecca has said it, there's no one size fits all. It's what works for one family may be extremely helpful and may not work for another family. So we've just tried to share some resources. These are all hyperlinks, and I am just thinking that may not come through on the Facebook Live. But Andrea, we can probably go through and add these in the comments after the presentation. So Adopt for Life has a dedicated page that has a series of webinars, parenting conversations, interviews with other experts in this area. So that page is available, is publicly available, and we'll put that link into a comment on the Facebook Live video. I referenced a couple of times the consortium website. So www.AFCCA/APFEA.ca. Oh, sorry, can we just go back one? There are a couple of international sites that we would recommend. Holes in the Wall is a UK website that is kind of a clearinghouse resource for research, for family strategies, family supports, that is really well done and quite reputable. Al Coates is a speaker and advocate out of the UK. His site has quite a bit of resources for parents and professionals. We've talked about Rebecca talked about a number of these different resources as she was going through the different stages, from self-reg, PACE parenting, understanding and healing from trauma. I would highlight for adoptive families, Pathways to Permanency is through the Adoption Council of Ontario and is free to all adoptive families post-adoption in Ontario, and does speak to this issue as well as just some of the broader underlying issues around attachment and trauma. And I will say myself as an adoptive parent is probably one of the best things I ever did. So strong advocate of taking Pathways to Permanency if you can. And then one we've just recently added, and it's interesting, I know some of the folks at PCMH have spoken about this one as well. We've certainly started to hear it from families within Adopt for Life, but from the Sash Bear Foundation, what they call their Family Connections program is a parenting skills capabilities. So it's that idea of skills development and capacity and understanding. We're hearing really, really good things about. So again, we'll put those links up into the comments. And then Rebecca, can you go on to the next slide?
Okay, why is it? Oh, there we go. Sorry about that.
So some related reading for those who learn best that way and want to receive that way. There's a number of really credible either books or articles or journals, and you see those referenced there. I would say Julie Selwyn and Helen Bonnick are quite reputable out of the UK and are taking very much a family-centered approach to understanding this. And then Rebecca talked about finding appropriate trauma-informed therapies. Certainly we are hearing from some families that a DDT approach can be helpful. And while it's new within Canada or newly understood within Canada, NVR or nonviolent resistance is a technique or a framework that is showing considerable promise for families that are experiencing AFCCA. So again, there are some links there that we will expand out those hyperlinks and put in the comments for everyone. And then can you go to the next slide, Rebecca? Last one again, just for the consortium website, AFCCA-APFEA.ca. The full report of the consortium is there. So more of the family stories and some of what's working for families, much more of the data. Again, for anyone who's watching, who is maybe in more of a clinical role or you're supporting families, there is a standalone operational definition document that is very much written by and for professionals. And then lastly, again, I spoke earlier about some of the systemic barriers. We think there is core work that needs to be done at all levels to improve families' abilities to access services and supports and help. And so there's a series of policy recommendations there for anyone who's interested in understanding that. And then the last slide I just wanted to touch on, again, there is some really exciting research getting underway in Canada, and much of it actually is centered in Ontario. So University of Ottawa through their lab around the International Lab of Rights of the Child, has an ongoing AFCCA research study. Part one of their study focused on parental perspectives. And so understanding AFCCA from a parent or caregiver lens, and there's a YouTube link there to their findings. It's really compelling. I would strongly suggest anyone who is experiencing this to watch that. And they're also getting started on this part two of their study that is about the voice of children and youth. So working with youth partners to understand their experience. And they're in fact seeking youth engagement partners right now to help engage on research design, as well as participate in that research over the next few months. So in that YouTube link that's referenced there, the researcher's contact information is available. And if you are a parent or caregiver who has a youth in your life that you feel like might be in a safe place to want to participate in that, because obviously we'd want our children or youth to be okay to do that. They are certainly looking at doing that from a child rights lens, and that work is just getting underway. And I think we went quickly through those, but I think that was the end. So I know we are at the top of the hour. I think we went a little bit long. But Andrea, I don't want to commit your team, but I think from our end, we'd be happy to stay on still for questions.
Absolutely. I'm going to stop the recording and stop the Facebook Live, and then we can take a few questions. If there's anybody who would like to ask a question, they can just unmute themselves.